Good morning. All right, so we had our first Wednesday night service. Good morning, Miss Pat and Miss KK. Good to see you guys this morning. We had our first Wednesday night service back last night. The ladies did a great job cooking. Enjoyed the pizza. Thank you for the ladies who didn't. There's one of them right there. Good morning, Miss Kristen. Enjoyed the pizza last night and the peach cobbler, and just enjoyed hanging out with God's people last night, talking about prayer, and so hope everyone is doing swell this morning. Don't forget communion. Communion Sunday morning, and also senior recognition. If you know of a senior that's going to be here and would like to be recognized, please let us know. We want to do that. Also, if you would like to partake in communion and you are don't feel comfortable coming to and assembling during the main services, 9:30 and 11, you can let me know and we'll take care of that together. But communion is one of those things that is very important for the believer. It is like baptism, is one of the ordinances of the church, and it's part of our Christian life and part of what we do in our Christian life. And the Christian just finds a way. That's what we do. So we find a way to do what God has commanded us to do, which kind of brings me to the devotion this morning. How that Christian people can be confusing folks when they live the Christian life, especially to a world that doesn't do that, and they're not used to doing that. I want to look. I was reading it 2 Samuel this morning, and in the life of David, a man after God's own heart, confused a lot of people. I'm going to read 2 Samuel chapter number 4, verse number 8. The Bible says, "And they bought the head of Ishbosheth unto David." Now, Ishbosheth was the king of the majority of Israel, and David was king at this time of Judah, and they were warring back and forth. So Ishbosheth basically was the enemy of David. He was the son, by the way, of King Saul, and we'll talk about King Saul here in just a minute. "Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, thine enemy," they said, "which sought thy life, and the Lord hath avenged my lord the king." That's how they looked at it. "This day of Saul and of his seed." And David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmah the Beerothite, and said unto them, "As the Lord liveth, who hath redeemed my soul out of all adversity." Verse number 10, the Bible says, "When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead." Now you remember that story, how the Amorite came by and Saul was wounded, and Saul told him, said, "Hey, kill me because I'm wounded, but they're going to end up, the Philistines are going to end up capturing me and torturing me, so kill me." But he wouldn't do it. And so Saul killed himself, but the Amorite, he took credit for it, and he took the crown to David, and he claimed that he killed Saul. And so this is what Saul's referring to. He said, "When one came to me saying, Behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought me good tidings, behold, I took him and slew him at Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings." He said it confused this guy. He thought I was going to be glad that Saul was dead. Because why? Because Saul had sought David's life. Saul was basically an enemy of David. How much more then these wicked men who have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? Shall not I therefore require their blood at his hand and take you away from the earth? And David commanded young men, and they slew them. So these guys thought, hey, we're going to bring the head of Ishbosheth to David, and David is going to be glad about it, because his enemy Ishbosheth is dead, and now David can become king. And David instead had them killed. Because why? The same reason he had the one who claimed to kill Saul killed. Because he said, weren't you afraid to raise your hand against God's anointed? Even though God's anointed, which he was God's anointed, had threatened and was trying to kill David. This didn't make sense to them. And my point is that the way the Christian sees life is often very confusing to this world. Hi, Miss Kathy, Michael Craver, Miss Kim. Good to see you guys. I want to read another verse to you that I was reading. As David brings, he's now been anointed king. David brings the ark of God into the city of David. And in verse number 19, David has been reunited with his wife, Michael. And verse number 16, the Bible says, and the ark of God came into the city of David, and Michael, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And later on, they have a discussion, and she says, boy, you've really made a fool of yourself today, because you've humbled yourself in front of these people. What she was expecting is for David to come in with the ark of God and ride in triumphantly with the ark of God. But what David had said is, I'm going to humble myself even more in the presence of God, because it's God who's made me who I am. And so the point this morning is, in the life of a Christian, in the life of Christians, when people look at the life well lived of a Christian, it can be confusing to the world. Because why? Because number one, we see God and we see everything else through that prism. Therefore, when we see God and we see everything else, then we see people differently. You see how David saw Saul, his enemy, or Saul was his enemy, but David never made himself Saul's enemy. So David saw the people in his life through the prism of who God was. So David never made himself an enemy of Saul, even though he fought against him. David never made himself an enemy of Ishbosheth. That was just a situation that David was in, even though there was a battle that David had to fight. But David would have never raised his hand against Ishbosheth, Saul's son. Because why? Not because David just wasn't a killer. This dude's a killer. The fact of the matter is, when David later on wants to build a temple, Nathan says, do whatever's in your heart. And God says, I didn't tell you to tell David to do that. You go back and tell David that he's a bloody man and I don't want him building a house for me. His son can do it. But David wouldn't raise his hands against God's anointed. He said, God put him as king. I'm not going to be the one to take him out. And so when we see people through the prism of who God made them to be, it changes. Then David also saw himself through the prism of God and who God made him to be. So when Michael, his wife, sees David leaping and dancing before the ark of God and humbling himself, then she doesn't understand it. It's confusing to her. She had been in the king's court already, and as the king's daughter, Saul's daughter, she said, why are you acting like that? Said, the handmaids of the king are equal with you, because that's what they ought to be doing. And David said, I'll humble myself even more, because I see myself in light of who God is. The point here is that a Christian, a believer, when they live the life that they live through the prism of who God is, it can be confusing to people. And so let me encourage you with this, that it is possible sometimes for you to be normal by yourself, that you might be the only one in your little circle at the time who's making a certain decision. Don't make what other people think or think you ought to do change what you do. It is completely normal for the believer, even if nobody else is doing it, to see other people through the prism of God. If somebody says, well, that ought to be your enemy, you say, no, listen, I'm going to let God do what God does. Well, you ought to think more of yourself. You ought to try to build yourself. You ought to use ambition and do what you do. Listen, I'm just going to let God do what God does, and I'm going to trust that He knows what He's doing. So today, let me just encourage you that when people are confused by your Christian stance, don't be discouraged by their confusion. Just do what God's called you to do. Have a great day, and we're excited about Sunday. We have some other stuff coming up and some meetings going on about how to do things better and safely, and so we're excited about what God's doing in our world. And listen, if you don't know the Lord today, or if today you need some help or some encouragement, please don't hesitate to give us a call. We love you guys. I prayed for you by name this morning, and hope you have a wonderful and blessed day. God bless.